Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the Arts Club of Chicago in person and at home. We're thrilled to have you here. I'm Janine Myleaf. I'm the executive director and chief curator of the club. And I just have a bit of housekeeping before I introduce the program. So please take a moment, turn off your cell phones. You're all moving toward them. Thank you. Okay. And then second, for our discussion this evening, the speakers would love for you to write down your questions on one of the index cards that are available. They're on the side, or you could have picked one up on your way in. If you do have a question written down, please raise your hand and someone from staff will pick it up for you during the conversation and we'll pass it up here and that will be integrated into the conversation. There will not be a Q&A afterwards. Okay. So now I'm so proud to introduce the third conversation in our Distinguished Architect series, which honors the memory of Don Powell. He's an architect whose timeless, elegant, and modern aesthetic left a beautiful mark on our city. And our moderator this evening, New York Magazine critic Justin Davidson, has been a wonderful interlocutor with me and a collaborator on helping to frame this conversation around the topic of design of cultural spaces. He's really helped us across the few lectures we've had so far and tonight to deeply think about what we recognize as culture and moving from informal spaces to cutting edge multi-use centers. And so tonight, I'm sure we'll hear much more along those lines. So one of the first names that came to us when we started to brainstorm about this series was our guest, Annabelle Selldorf. Her name has become equivalent with brilliant museum design. She's the principal and design lead of Selldorf Architects, and she has been responsible for some of the most significant museum reconsiderations in recent memory. She's overseen the expansion and enhancement of the Frick Collection in New York, the redesign of the Sainsbury Wing and public realm of the National Gallery in London, the expansion of the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, and the revitalization of the Hirshhorn Museum with SOM. So I can't think of a better person to continue this conversation than Ms. Selldorf. And before they launch their conversation, I'd like to acknowledge Steve Larson, the nephew of Don Powell, who joins us this evening with his wife, Patsy, to remember his uncle. They've traveled all the way from Seattle, so thank you for being here. And to ask Don's partner in life and work, Rob Kleinschmidt, to just say a few brief words before we get started.
Thank you for that, the lovely words of praise, Janine. Don was always interested in current events, and he would be proud to have this third evening program with Annabelle Selldorf this evening. And I feel that the whole series, this being number 3 of 4, is off to a wonderful start with many friends and colleagues in the audience. And it's just wonderful and superb to see this many people here that knew Don and knew me. So enjoy it, and thank you for coming, and look forward to your attendance in number 4, which will be May 23rd, Joshua Armas. So welcome, glad you're all here.
Well, thank you everybody for being here. I'm delighted to have come and to be here with Annabelle. I think this is such an interesting kind of thread of conversation, this idea of space, the relationship between space and culture. And of course, sitting in a room at the Arts Club that is, part of that whole project of creating and occupying space for culture. It's a great way to have these conversations. And I was just thinking about the range that we've already covered, from Liz Diller talking about creating architecture and an institution at the same time in the case of the Shed, and also trying to tease out the DNA of longstanding institutions like the Museum of Modern Art, or trying to sort of repurpose in a radical way a classic like the Hirshhorn in a way that, as she told us, didn't ultimately work out, but it was this kind of like wild idea that almost worked out. And then moving on to Anupama Kundu, who had a completely different framework and talked to us about the culture, the relationship between culture and architecture in the actual building. And in the design, so the culture of design, of craftsmanship, of community, of local manufacture, and how those things came together for her. So we've got a very different kind of conversation today with Annabelle, who began her life and career as Annabelle Selldorf, but has been Annabelle Selldorf now for quite a long time, and a New Yorker. And one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about was how you approach these august institutions that have such deeply rooted traditions and people who feel very strongly about them, where there's a real emotional connection for going back generations. And you come along as an architect and have to reinterpret that for the future. And so we'll talk also about buildings that you did from scratch. But so if you want to start just by sort of taking us to your practice and where you are and what it's like to work in your office, and what the life of an architect is like.
Oh, that's a big one. First of all, thank you all for being here. I'm absolutely thrilled to be in Chicago, and I'm extra thrilled that two people that I care about very much from the office are also here, who both live in Chicago. Susan Parapetti and Matt Kanuski, who both have been with the office for a long time. So maybe we should give the microphone to them, because they would know what it's like to work in the office.
What we really want to know is what it's like to work for you.
With me. I started the office as a single person. It was just me. And I didn't think I was starting the office. I just thought that I was doing the work of a designer and an architect because it would afford to work at night and go to see exhibitions during the day. I really did think that. And it didn't last very long, as you can imagine. But it's that kind of maybe naivete that I retained, and that helps me do things that would otherwise intimidate me. Doesn't mean that I don't get intimidated, but I get so excited about the opportunity of doing something that I don't see what the perils may well be, or the pitfalls, or the traps, but rather think, oh, they're asking me for assistance here. I'm excited.
It sounds like you had a deep connection to art, to visual art, from the beginning, that architecture and art were, at least in your life, intertwined right away.
My father was an architect, became an architect, not as somebody who trained at university, but who practiced for a long time in post-war Germany. And he had an excellent eye and a great deal of appreciation for both art, craft, quality, and creativity. And as did my mother. And I grew up in, probably you can say, post-war Cologne, Cologne in Germany. Cologne was just about completely decimated in the war and rebuilt with post-haste.
Yeah, there's that famous aerial photograph from after the war of just the cathedral miraculously standing and everything else around it reduced to rubble.
Yeah, and I think that growing up in a place like that, that had a very loaded history, a great deal of pain, guilt, fear, all of those things were part and parcel of what made up everyday life, and a kind of urgency in the production of art, maybe more so art than architecture. But my parents were very close friends with any number of artists who lived and practiced in Cologne. And so that was what we did. We'd go to museums, we'd go to churches, not to pray, but to see the beautiful Romanesque churches. Cologne has some really fantastic Romanesque churches that survived the bombings. And it wasn't really a question whether we liked that or not, because that's what we were doing. And I liked it. So that was, part of what I did when I was a teenager. I'd go to galleries, and by the time that I got to Cologne, I knew all kinds of artists and galleries, and I was more connected to that than necessarily architecture and other architects.
So I wonder that background, that deep rootedness in art, and that experience of going to see art in what must have been many different kinds of, rough and sophisticated sorts of venues, sometimes, maybe even in people's homes or studios. Where did that leave you about your sense of what needs to be around a painting? I mean, that's right, a fundamental architectural question that you face when you start working. But I've talked to artists and some critics who are really not interested in anything that's outside the frame, and basically think it should be as blank and neutral and uninteresting as possible, because all you really want is that immediate relationship with the artwork.
There is no such a thing as neutral. I actually remember a long drunken conversation with an artist friend at the Odeon in 1992.
Can't have been that drunken if you remember the year.
Yeah, I'm speculating. Be that as it may, I think there is no such thing as a neutral space. And in my mind, what's interesting is that there is a kind of intangible element that that's very personal to me. I try and design spaces for art that reflect how I would like to see art. And that represents obviously a bias, but it's not the only bias I look at. I try and think about, how do we people experience art, and why does it matter? And I think that our memory of how, where, and when we look at art enters our long-term memory. I remember going to the Frick early days when I was in New York, and having affinities for this, that, or the other work of art, and always remembering where certain paintings hung. For example, there is that Bronzino that is one of my favorite paintings, and it always hung in a place that seemed not kind to the painting. It seemed like it was crowded and intimidated. And then some years later, it was placed in a different, sort of more solitary context, and you could literally visit with that person. It remains one of my favorite paintings, but oddly, it illustrated to me, or made it maybe I became conscious of the fact of how much, when we look at art, it is related to the context, not just the physical spatial context, but some of it is who we are, where we are at, and how things how we can anchor the work of art in our own context. And the more you can make that possible, the kinder you can be, allowing for that experience to happen, I think the better that is.
Yeah, it's a little bit like, your memory of reading a book is so sometimes associated with where you read it and what the weather was like and what you were drinking and who was around you. It's these connections to the experience that are.
Vodka Gimlets, 1992 at the Odeon.
What were you reading? Right, because and actually, I've had this experience in your. This is jumping the gun a little bit because I want to start going through the slides so we can see some of this. But I have had this experience in your work of a connection with a piece of art that I hadn't had before, even if I was familiar with it, specifically with the Frick, as we'll see. Well, so let's take a look at some of your.
Who's operating the slides?
Yeah,
Me?
Yep, you're in the pilot seat.
I don't know how to do this. Do I?
Go ahead.
So I'm going to try to do this quite quickly. I'll show a couple of images of this gallery, Michael Werner in New York City on 67th Street, 21 East 67th Street, the first gallery and in a sense, the first public space I did. Michael Werner was a illustrious architect, art dealer, gallerist in Cologne, who I didn't know when I was in Cologne, but I knew of him and I knew his gallery, I knew his artists. And when he opened a gallery in New York, he didn't want to work with an architect because he just thought they overthought things. And nevertheless, he hired me. There are like long, fun stories about that. And he said, I'm going to go away. I'll come back and show me the drawings. And I thought, but he didn't answer any of my questions. And so this was long before cell phones, long before fax machines and things like that. Maybe fax machines existed. But point was that I worked through an entire set of not just design drawings, but working drawings, not knowing whether the client would like it or not. By today's standard, this was a small place. It was maybe 2,000 square feet. But with every line I drew, I thought, well, I'm making a decision here. And Lord knows whether he likes that or not. Long story short, we got on, we agreed on certain things. But what remained in that experience was that I realized that what I do is something that people can experience. And in turn, in the dialogue with Michael Werner, who was a really very interesting person, he made it clear to me how important it is to look, to perceive, and to let the experience of seeing resonate deeply. And in some ways, I credit him with my way of working in and around art.
I feel like you skipped the part where he came back and either loved it or told you to start again.
No, okay, I'll tell you that story then. It was summertime. He's hired me and said, I'm going to go away on holiday for 6 weeks and I'll come back at the end of August and I'll come see you. And he came 2 days before he said he was coming, and I was like barely done with the drawings. And he looked quietly and silently at the drawings. And at some point, when we looked at this door, he pulled out a crumpled piece of paper out of his pocket, and lo and behold, he had drawn a door on this. And he put it, and it was like scribbles. He wasn't an architectural draftsperson, put his drawing next to my drawing. And then I know I don't have a German accent. He does. He said, okay, yours looks better. And that was sort of the beginning of a good relationship. Anyway,
So was the outcome of that he helped you understand that as an architect, you have agency in that relationship between the client and the buyer, but also the viewer and the artwork, that you actually have a role, an active role to play there?
oh, I think it took many more years for me to realize that. In fact, many more years. But what he did do is he made me sort of isolate the act of designing from having to prove creativity in a way. And again, I wasn't so clear about that. I believe that what you do as an architect is very, very, very different from what you do as an artist. I don't think of myself as an artist, though I do think that architecture is the highest form of art. And in fact, the mother of all arts. What's the difference? Well, it's pretty obvious, right? There's utilitarian purpose at the origin of it, but so many more influences and so much more longevity. We build a building and you can't argue it away, whereas with most works of art, you can move them around. They have different responsibilities. Anyway, that we could talk about that all night.
Well, I'm fascinated with that distinction, that architecture, or the sort of almost paradoxical statement you made, architecture is the highest art and the mother of all arts, but you as an architect are not an artist.
Well, you're an artist on a different level. You know, a writer is an artist, I would say. A musician is an artist. An architect is definitely an artist, but they're not the same as now I can't think of the English expression. You're not a painter, you're not free to do what you want to do.
Well,
You are.
I think maybe, I'm sure we'll talk about this more, but because what I'm interested in here is the role of the architect in mediating that experience, in surrounding a work of art and contributing to the experience of it, as you were talking about.
Well, in some ways, like I said, it's a very personal thing, because I, for the most part, think that the work we do is based in rational thinking. But if it lacks intuition and artistic desire, it doesn't get anywhere. And I try to keep the two very close together so that you don't do any one thing too much. There is architecture that is so rational that it chills your bones. And there is architecture that is so overly intuitive and lacks reason, that it's hard to negotiate. And I try to keep the two close together.
And also somewhere in the middle of those extremes is the architecture that is assertive enough and characteristic enough, right, to have a presence, to have a personality, but not so much that it interferes with the job that it has to do, which in some cases is very flexible, right? You have to be able to be a container for all different kinds of art that's changing all the time, and for all different people who are coming through and having a whole range of different experiences.
Yeah, I think the question of confidence is a really very good one, because for a long time, I was afraid of colleagues and architectural discussions, because what I like to do is very, very little. And if it's sort of like, I like to eat spaghetti with butter and salt. but you know, that's a very minimal taste. And I could eat that every day. So if that's what you do, then people who want to do more than that kind of tend to think that you're very boring.
If that's what you love, you don't become a chef.
Exactly. No, but my point is that I've never felt bad about eating spaghetti with butter and salt, provided that they're cooked just so, and that the butter is good quality, and that all of that, right? Where I'm going with this is that I haven't lacked confidence with that boredom. Or anyway, it's the only path I know to take. So as a result of that, you have to hold counsel with yourself,
Mhm.
because most people want more.
Okay, let's see how, hold that thought, but let's see how that you actually realize that.
Yeah, so here is the office in Michael Werner's office, and we had an art storage and this unbelievably sumptuous green velvet. I don't know if you remember that space, but
I don't.
but it was very beautiful. Yeah, that's not shy. But it was different. It wasn't like any contemporary art gallery did fancy curtains, or walnut furniture for that matter. The space was very rich with really distinct, beautiful materials. And so in some ways it was not minimal, except that there weren't very many elements of anything, and all of it was in good and fine balance. So time went on, and the first gallery that Hauser and Wirth opened in Zurich, they asked me to help them. And that was great. That was my first international job, so to speak. And it was very different because I learned that when you are an architect, you're not just responsive to the art spaces, but you're responsive to the people that you're working with, who like to express themselves in a particular way. And maybe that's one of the most interesting things for me, is to sort of absorb all of that and respond to it. And that is a little bit where some of the intangible is, but where you also can find a line of argument, if you will. So I don't know if that makes sense. It was a beautiful space. It actually still exists. It's on top of an old brewery, and there was this beautiful glass wall. And so we made these very simple spaces, and that Richter painting never looked better, I think. And then you interrupt me and ask me if otherwise I just keep going.
I keep thinking about the spaghetti with butter metaphor. It's like, it is, but there's like one truffle on top of the.
Okay, I'll take the truffle, but not every day. Yeah, I don't know that I've used that analogy before, but I tend to think it's a good one.
Well, let's go on, because I think in a funny way, you're creating a set of expectations that, or you're describing your work in a way that then becomes surprising.
Okay. Some years later, in the late 1990s, I was lucky to be hired to do the renovation of the Neue Galerie in New York on 86th Street, a museum for German and Austrian art. And surely it was because of my German accent that Ronald Lauder hired me. But it was...
You were the one person who could be counted on to pronounce the name of the museum correctly.
That's right, exactly. it was a real privilege to do this project because, among other things, and it's very hard to imagine, it wasn't an institution before. It was an institution that didn't exist. It was Ronald Lauder's speculation that people wanted to look at German and Austrian art post 1945. And we didn't know whether they were going to want to come or not. And Ronald always thought that having a Viennese cafe would ensure that people would come, because if they didn't want to look at art, they would.
There's always the strudel.
There's always a strudel.
And I should say, by the way, my wife is a visual art critic. She writes about all the museums in New York for the Financial Times. And she told me specifically to tell you that this is her favorite museum to go to in New York. That's a pretty high bar.
I think that is a high bar. Thank you. Let's meet her there at the cafe.
It's a date.
But the process of designing this museum was very interesting because it was very, very specific. There were Renee Price, the director, was part and parcel of it. And she is tremendously knowledgeable, hugely sensitive, and really has a vivid imagination. Ronald Lauder has an exceptional eye and brings that to bear all the time. But he was also hugely trusting of me, who was, I had never done a museum before. I didn't know how many coats to accommodate, because we didn't know how many people were going to come. We didn't know how many, every single aspect of this had to kind of be invented. And today we would expect that we would have a large list of professional consultants. We had some professional consultants, but they weren't museum experts. And the making of this museum taught me just so much that I can't, to this day, I always relate every other thing to getting to this.
So I just want to pause here for a second, because I was thinking about your talking about sort of a minimalist approach and almost sort of like flirting with boredom, your word. And here you're doing a museum. And first of all, it's in a domestic, what had been a domestic space, right? It's a mansion on Fifth Avenue. Second of all, it's not at all like a sort of industrial space or like a new space on top of a brewery or like one office in an existing building. It's a fancy, ornate Beaux-Arts building in New York.
Carrera and Hastings,
Carrera and Hastings, 1914. So really quite distant from the kind of background that you're talking about. Also, you're talking about a period in art which is extreme, right? Where so many of the forms of expression that are in that Viennese and German tradition are expressionistic and intense and loaded. So you're dealing with these elements, and you have no idea who the viewers are, as you said, because you didn't know whether there was an audience for this. So how do you, when you're trying to come up with the interiors and the way of bringing people through that space and experiencing that art in that building, where do you start?
Well, there was a whole lot of conviction that this was the right thing to do from both Ronald and everybody on the team. And so doubt wasn't particularly a part of it until the very end, when we were like, what if nobody shows up? But even that was not real doubt. So where do you start? I think you get up in the morning and you brush your teeth and you sort of do that. You measure the building, you try and think about what are we going to exhibit? How does it get lit? How we knew that we wanted a museum quality HVAC system. And this was very complicated because the building truly wasn't equipped to carry that, and sort of snaking ducts in through the building in ways that one couldn't necessarily see to open that skylight that you see here. It had been covered over to introduce what is a kind of lay light in what used to be the music room. They were in some ways step by step acquisitions. I often think that you sort of rope the design in, you draw the big picture skeleton, and then one by one find the solutions, find the definition. However boring or marginal what we do is, it takes a very long time, because I can't make all of the decisions all at once, even if there are very few decisions. But actually, if it looks that there are few decisions, it means that there were that many more. And it wasn't just me deciding, right? Everybody was opinionated. Everybody knew more than I did. And all of it had to be drawn and built. And so it was an intense and long process. And sort of, I ultimately really think that most of the time vision evolves incrementally. Even if you can articulate a big picture goal, and even if along the process you can never forget what the big picture goal is. The big picture goal is to bring people to art. And so you always have to be on the people's side.
You know, looking at this picture, it strikes me that there's and here you talk about the process. You know, on the one hand, looking particularly at a painting is essentially a two-dimensional experience, right? You're looking at I mean, paintings can have their depth, but they are a two-dimensional art form on a flat wall. And the closest communion you can have with a painting is to be standing in front of it, and everything else kind of disappears from your field of vision. It's like in that moment, it's really just you and the two-dimensional thing in front of you. But standing in this room, it's clear, like from the photograph, that there's a lot of those experiences that add up to a whole environment. And on top of that, I think what you were getting at is that the whole experience from the time you approach the building to the time you ultimately leave is really conditioning all of that. So the quality of the air circulation, the temperature, of course, the humidity as governed by the rules that govern museums, the need for vapor barriers and so on, but also, you know, where the bathrooms are, and that people are comfortable enough, and how crowds are managed, like how they flow through, and none of those things is really visible, right, in a photograph. So you're dealing with a photograph of a visual experience, which is ultimately really only a small part of the architecture.
Boy, I'm so glad you're saying that. I think that is one of the biggest challenges we encounter nowadays, is that everything is accessible on your cell phone or your computer, as it were. And the experience of architecture is one that is not just three-dimensional, but many multiple dimensions more, that are part and parcel of what you're saying. And I think they're also resonant in very different ways. We don't necessarily perceive immediately the sounds, the smells, the tactile experience that spaces, buildings, towns provide for us. And they sometimes take a long time to emerge. So the degree of intuition that goes into producing all of that is very difficult to put into words.
So another thing I want to ask you about this project, I don't know, maybe you want to want to see some other images from there. Or just go back to the previous slide. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the experience of the relationship between old and new. Whether when you're doing a project like this in an old building, especially around art that's from a particular historical period. And so there's stylistic touches on the interior of the building too. What do you want people to feel about that? Do you want them to mistake some of your interventions for things that have been there all the time? Do you want them to have a clear demarcation between the past and the present? What's your approach to that kind of integration of history into a new iteration?
Well, nothing is the same. Every building is different. I am not so happy that people think that some very nasty journalist said that we took the jobs that nobody else wanted. And apparently there were jobs like the Neue Galerie or the Frick, but it's not, I'm not talking about renovation. To me, architecture in a sense is not about distinguishing between one or the other. But here is a Carrere and Hastings buildings that has intrinsic qualities that you recognize. And as a contemporary architect, and mark my words because they apply to the Sainsbury, you try and enter a dialogue with that building. You try to understand what were the intentions, what is the power of that intention. Was it successful or not? Does it sustain the test of time? Because guess what? Things do change. In 30 years, our lives have changed dramatically vis-a-vis security, vis-a-vis our ability to, well, just think about how accessible things are digitally now and how that influences our way of looking, thinking, etc. Anyway, my point is that in an existing building, no matter what era, you have to take that on and sort of put yourself face to face with it. And yes, you need to be decisive. You need to take a position. I think, generally speaking, I'm very reverent toward quality and toward coherence of a building. But this Carrere and Hastings building, for example, is not their best building. There were misaligned arches. There were all kinds of sort of things where you think they must have had a very young architect on that thing, and they used the millwork drawings that were already in the drawer. Nevertheless, there are wonderful spaces in here, and thinking about how people experience these spaces and not pulling the rug out from under it in favor of making a case for myself is, I think, sort of a fundamental attitude that marks our work.
So let's skip ahead to the two Fricks. Because so the Frick is another mansion, of course.
On the way, of course, you have to see some contemporary architecture.
Well, that's fine.
I'm not going to say anything about it, but just saying. It's there. It's not shy. It felt good when Richard Serra came to the opening of this exhibition and said, "Good space." That was as good as getting a medal. I'm also not going to talk about building recycling facilities in Brooklyn.
Maybe we can come back to that. I just really want.
There's no coming back.
There's a back button. It's a recycling facility.
Oh, that's true. Not talking about Venice either? Okay,
Say
fine.
whatever you want.
All right. We'll just go through it. You're going to want to talk about San Diego at some point. Clark? No. Okay, not about Clark.
Okay. So the reason I wanted to skip from the Neue Gallery to the Frick, and then we can come back to those things, but I just want to make sure that
No.
we touch on this, and then also the Sainsbury wing of the National Gallery. So this is the Marcel Breuer building, which was the Whitney, and then was taken over by the Metropolitan Museum for their contemporary and modern activities for a while. And then you designed the renovation of the original Frick building, and during that shutdown for the work on that, the collection of the Frick moved it into the Breuer building temporarily. Now, I had been many times to the Frick before it closed, and I found this, that kind of revelation that you were talking about. You were talking about when they moved to Bronzino. I was really astonished at how different the experience was in taking sort of unpacking this tightly concentrated suitcase of the domestic space of the Frick and expanding it into the space of what had been built as a museum, and being able to come sort of face to face with art that without sort of all the stuff and the furniture in between. I'm also glad that's only temporary. It's going to go back. But it really was a remarkable experience. And I was just hoping you could talk a little bit about what that's like for you, both to change the Frick, to move all the stuff, sort of make a new space for it, and then, with a plan to move it back.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief about it, because getting to know the Frick collection, the building on 70th Street, was way more complicated than just having gone to visit it. It's always been one of my favorite museums in New York, together with the Neue Galerie. And I thought I knew the spaces, I thought I knew the art, and I was comfortable there. I appreciated all the same things that so many people appreciate, and never really took inventory of what didn't work until the day that we were invited to participate in the competition that we ultimately won. And I did an extensive tour across the building, and I realized how much was missing in the visitor's experience. I'll leave it at that for the time being, because then came a very extensive, long process of defining the program, defining the goals, knowing that that people had spoken clearly, loudly to our clients, the Frick collection, about maintaining the 70th Street garden, which previously had 3 big townhouses standing there. Anyway, people forget what spaces were like, and so that garden has now really rooted itself in people's memories and minds. So as we embarked on this very long process of talking about what we were going to do, all of it was in lockstep with how do we look at art and how do we bring people to art, and so on and so forth. And in that process, Ian Wardropper was able to make an agreement with the Metropolitan Museum to sublet the Breuer building and bring the highlights of the collection to the Breuer. And I was so eager and so anxious for them to ask me to help them with the design, and waited for that call until it finally came. And it was a really interesting process, because I didn't know how was that going to work, but I wasn't afraid of bringing old master paintings or decorative arts or sculpture into that building. But but you have to go through the process of doing it, of confronting the art, confronting the spaces. And I think that the Breuer is a very, very good piece of architecture because it played along. It was as if it was made to allow us to create spaces, very specific spaces for the collection. And of course, what is fantastic when you're going through the Frick Madison is that for once you see the collection in chronological order, by country, in a kind of museological exhibition, rather.
Can we see a couple of interiors?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Yes, and just a reminder, if you have questions, there are cards.
Here's the
And
Barbet.
They actually do
Angel.
get to me.
And we devised a partition system that at once made very distinct spaces, but allowed sort of vistas across. Rembrandts all of a sudden speak to one another, but they have room to breathe. And I think maybe one of the most spectacular and really radical ways to exhibit art is to show the Bellini painting in this space with the expressive window looking at a white brick 1960s apartment building.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it was the fact that if you went to the Breuer, to the Whitney in its old incarnation, there was a certain relationship between, the American art and the kind of modernity that it embodied and the modernity of the building, right? There was this harmony between them. So when I went to the Frick after it reopened to the Breuer building after it reopened as the Frick, I had no idea what it would be like to see this, art from many different periods, but old masters in that kind of environment. And this is definitely a moment that I remember. You would not, it almost shouldn't work. And yet it does.
Yeah. And again, it's not something that just happened serendipitously. It was work. We really did think about these places. We did think about how thick should the walls be. They're a little bit thicker than they had to be, but it lent a kind of weight and presence to the partitions that they didn't otherwise have. But it's working with the building, and the building definitely allowed that. And the curators, of course, Xavier Solomon, ahead of everyone, they were so excited about the challenge. And it was, at times, the architects were talking about the art and the curators were talking about the spaces. And it was that collaborative spirit, the exchange of ideas and what you wanted to see and what you didn't want to experience, that made that both very interesting. But again, didn't happen overnight.
So I know you did a lot of the design work, or I believe you did a lot of the design work on the original Frick building before this, right? So was there a way in which this experience then, if you want to talk about the original building and what you're doing there, but is there a way that this experience then played back into how you're working on the Frick mansion and how expanding that?
I don't think that is the case directly. I think what does happen is because this was such an isolated event, is I got to know the collection in ways in which I never could have dreamed of, and for that I'm very grateful, and that's why I like to do exhibition design, because it gets you really close to the art.
Can you explain a little bit about what you're doing with the Frick building while the paintings are on vacation?
Yeah, so the Frick collection really hasn't had any significant renovation, maintenance, upkeep since 1935, pretty much. And so there are aging skylights, the infrastructure was very frayed, to say the least. Accommodation of staff was less than acceptable. Many infrastructural items on their last leg, but very significantly, it became clear to the Frick that they couldn't build in the garden, but that they had to up their game, not to have more visitors, not to have more blockbuster shows, but to place their collection in a context and to actually really be more mindful of people who come to the museum. You will have had this discussion with other people, is if you don't grow up going to museums, you're likely to never go. If our disposition is to bring more people to art and a more diverse group of people to art, then we have to reach out, extend our hand, and truly welcome people, truly inspire them, and sort of understand what keeps you out. Well, if it's raining outside and you can't get in because there's a long line outside, it's likely you're not going to go. And it's a collection of things that keep people away. It's an attitude that museums bring to the public that tends to be intimidating. No better building but the Frick, a millionaire industrialist who was famous for not treating people very well, who built an intimidating building initially with Carrere and Hastings and eventually with John Russell Pope. So what can we do in 2023 to improve the situation? We're not going to tear the building down, and it's highly landmarked, but there's many initiatives that make it more agreeable for people to come. Any number of humble interventions, from, I don't know, making the building accessible with ramps, with having staff that reaches out to you, that is more communicative. I could go on and on and on, but suffice it to say that we thought about this. We really didn't, it wasn't just to think about, are we going to fix that molding and put a better bulb in here? No, we thought about what are we doing and why are we doing it? And to me, that was really the thing that changed my life a little bit, because I realized that intuitively, I know how to fix a staircase, or I don't know, build a wall, what have you. It's not just about positioning the art, but it's making a difference in a bigger way.
So I hear you about the experience. We talked a little bit about that, about what it's like to go and be comfortable and be able to commune with the art directly, and you know, what was the I'm forgetting now. There was the blockbuster exhibit that the Frick did have, which created immense crowds and basically became very difficult for a while to go to. But there's a bit of a tension there, right? Because the more accessible you make it, the more inviting you make it, the more people want to go, the more it changes the character of the museum. And we've seen with Liz Diller, we talked about MoMA going from a series of small contained galleries that people have very fond memories of, that also in some ways didn't work very well, to becoming gradually sort of a mega institution that has swallowed, you know, the entire block in Midtown. And there was some reaction, right, when to this renovation of the Frick, fear that the Frick was going to become kind of an institution that was larger than it really. What people really liked about it was this kind of being able to react to art in a domestic space, and fear that it was going to become more.
I love that you bring this up. This is an institution that comprises approximately 180,000 square feet. We're adding, I think, 8,000 square feet. That's diminutive. It's not about making the museum bigger. It's making it more accessible. Whoever has been to the Frick has been at the bottom of that beautiful grand staircase and looked upstairs and has wanted to go up there.
Yeah.
Now you have to understand that the Frick has expanded their collection. Gifts, purchases, etc., have expanded the collection pretty significantly, and very little of it was on view by the time that the museum closed. One of the key reasons why this renovation is happening is to make the second floor accessible, so people can see where the Fricks slept. And
in fact, the president of the Frick, Ian Wardropper, is giving up his office, right? Am I right about that?
That's right. Damn, it was nice to sit in his
It was a
office.
nice office, but
It was
he
a
had
nice
to move out
office.
because people are going to want to go in there.
But it was a hard working office. It was an office where, anyway, well, that's a different discussion perhaps. But the point is that we made so many presentations. Anybody who wanted to spend 5 minutes on understanding or spending time on the explanations of what we were doing and why we are doing it, would have felt reassured that not only were we celebrating the landmark, but we had the experience of the same number of visitors at heart rather than a larger number of visitors.
Can you show us a little bit about what that experience will?
Well, this is a section showing you that we're making a former vault, turning that into an auditorium, and making a vertical connection that allows people in a wheelchair to also get to the second floor. And that cross direction across to the rooms in the mansion. And a larger reception area that connects you to a new special exhibitions gallery, because the Frick didn't have a special exhibitions gallery, which actually is necessary, not just for blockbuster shows, but to sort of create context to the collection. And here is an image of one sort of maybe more contemporary architectural expression of the auditorium in below the garden. And this auditorium is not very big. It's about 220 seats and has to do double duty. There are a lot of lectures, conversations such as ours, but also music and sort of smaller performances take place there. So it was an interesting aspect to make this little jewel of a space down below, and it's very exciting to see that under construction now. And then we always close with this picture because it shows that the tableau garden that you could really just see a little bit from the reception hall and from 71st Street now will be experienced by more people, because there's an education center on the other side here on the north side of the garden, and a cafe that's looking down in the garden, and a second floor over the reception hall that also appreciates the garden. So the garden that was the big argument in a way has become the nexus of bringing everybody together and seeing how there is movement and light and people in the building. And I think that that's a very powerful gesture.
So now for somebody who prides yourself on making surgical interventions, on doing just the right amount of new stuff in existing and much beloved buildings, you do sometimes get yourself into trouble with people who have those close relationships, right? No more so than with the Sainsbury wing at the National Gallery in London, which we should talk about next.
Well,
let me just explain what I mean. That the National Gallery acquired what's now called the Sainsbury wing when first this is on Trafalgar Square in London, so absolutely central to.
Do you want me to do the introduction?
Hmm?
Do you want me to do the
Sure,
introduction?
go ahead.
So Trafalgar Square was built after the original building that is today the National Gallery, commonly referred to as the Wilkins Building. It sits central to Trafalgar Square, and in 2009, Norman Foster added a staircase, pedestrianizing what used to be a road, an extension of Pall Mall across Trafalgar Square. This is important because the building, with its very prominent portico, communicates a central relationship to Trafalgar Square, and commonly is interpreted as, or anyway, that is what I am told, that is a long distance sign to say, enter here. Now, somebody else might say, it's actually a sign to say, stay away from this intimidating architecture. But, you know, you take your pick, because any given day you can argue one way or the other. Be that as it may, in 1992, the National Gallery had prevailed after a very arduous, very long process to build a new building that was called the Sainsbury Wing on what was previously called the Hampton site. The Hampton site was had a building on it at one time that was bombed in the war and sat empty, belonging to the Canadian government for a very long time. Long story short, eventually Venturi Scott Brown were hired in a very controversial, the second very controversial competition, and built the Sainsbury Wing at the behest of the Sainsbury family.
I mean, I do just, sorry for jumping in, but I do feel like we should, one little parenthetical in there was that along the way, there was a previous design before Venturi Scott Brown for the extension of the National Gallery, which was all set to go until Prince Charles decided that he was dead set against it. Am I wrong about that?
Yes.
Okay, well, please correct me. Don't
But
want to
this,
spread disinformation.
but this is how
This is how the
things
story,
happen.
yes,
What
how
is
disinformation gets spread.
what's instrumental about this, in the process of that competition's approval, that was a highly expressive modernist design, the architects and client had to go through an approval process with the Council of Westminster. Before Westminster agreed at a dinner at the Royal Institute of British Architects, Prince Charles was overheard saying, and thereafter always quoted, that he thought the design of this winning competition looked like a carbuncle on a good friend's face. This was immediately picked up as an incendiary remark. It was very controversial. And when Westminster, for reasons of their own, decided not to approve that building, Prince Charles was immediately implicated as being the one who either forced Westminster's hand, who made that decision unilaterally, even though he was just merely a prince. The reality is the two things went hand in hand. Whether you like the decision or not, the English were not happy that somebody had made a unilateral decision, and certainly that unattractive remark didn't help matters. But interesting that you recount the story this way, because many, many people think that Prince Charles said that about the Sainsbury Wing, which of course isn't true. It was the design that never was built that was assailed in that manner.
Oh, yes, that much I understood.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying it's.
Yes. Okay, so that design didn't happen. Venturi Scott Brown did build what is now known as the Sainsbury Wing, and then you won a competition to modernize that. What's the right word? To renovate it.
Yeah, so it bears saying I introduced the notion of entry on the center of Trafalgar Square. The Sainsbury Wing was finished in 1992, as I said, and it features, as you can see in this photograph, a very large on-grade entry. Already in 1992, you could get into that building in a wheelchair without having to climb any stairs. Now, it is always said that this building wasn't designed as the main entry, but it was designed to house the galleries where the story of art and somewhat logically, the beginning of your visit would be. Not only could you enter on grade, there were also elevators that would take you directly to the galleries if you were able to find them, and a very, very grand staircase that leads you up that way. The only grand staircase in the entire National Gallery. So yes, maybe it wasn't meant to be the main entrance, but it happened to be a very popular entrance. And after many attempts to make the portico accessible by a variety of different architects who provided master plans, it became clear that not only was it going to be very difficult and very undignified to send people via complicated ramps and additions to the to the old Wilkins facade, that after years of discussions, the National Gallery trustees decided that the main entrance had to be the Sainsbury Wing. It just so happened that that when it rains, people now have to stand outside because the security protocol has changed very much. And some people say that this was beautiful at one time. I wouldn't be one of them, but there were definite problems with the spaces on the ground floor, the public spaces, so to speak, not the exhibition spaces on the second floor that the director Gabriele Finaldi calls near perfect. But the experience for people to enter is very compromised. It's compromised among other reasons because in the early 90s, when the program was articulated, the program was such that the simplest way of explaining it is that the second floor galleries had to be on level with the galleries in the Wilkins building. That left exactly 8 meters between the ground and the gallery floor. And there was so much program on a defined area that 2 full floors were necessary to cover, to answer to that program. And it produced what I think is a very unpleasant experience of a kind of low ceilinged lid above your head. And the architects tried to introduce these coffers with cool fluorescent light to help with the experience.
It's the operating room aesthetic.
That's right, exactly. And in the 90s, that was the way things went. So many really totally objective reasons required rethinking the visitor's experience. On the heels of their bicentenary, the trustees decided to undergo a renovation. And
now, Carrera and Hastings weren't around to discuss your plans with you, but Denise Scott Brown is, and you were telling me that you had a series of conversations with her, but that in the end, she was not willing to come on board with your ideas, and in fact was publicly very critical of them afterwards. In fact, there were some critics who, it was sort of a letter written by a series of presidents of former presidents of the Royal Institute of British Architects, collectively complaining about your plans. The implication being that it was kind of like becoming more generic. I think they compared it to an airport lounge. Which airport, I'm not sure.
Airport lounges have gotten so much better.
They're nice, right? If you can get in. Denise Scott Brown had kind of went in the other direction and said that your design was like a circus clown wearing a tutu, which is really not at all like an airport lounge, I don't think. I mean, not when I've been in. So, maybe these criticisms come from different directions, but you've had to absorb a lot of blows and sort of respond to them.
Well, one always wants to experience praise, for sure. But as I said earlier, I think in some ways you have to hold counsel with yourself about the reasons why you're doing things. It begins with embracing the reason for this renovation in the first place. We work with a lot of teams. There are consultants, our internal team, closely with the client, and reasonable argument is being made all the time. Not one decision, not a single one just happens as the result of my willful, I'm wearing a tutu today. So in the spirit of that, before winning the competition, this was during COVID, we had 3 months to study the building. And I spent a great deal of time studying the plans, the sections, understanding what the circulation paths were, and discovered what the strength of the partie of this Sainsbury wing is. It exists. It's a good, powerful building. It's badly executed, and it's somewhat outdated in its interior functions 30-some years later. It's a listed building, and it's a listed building for good reason. There is some really powerful architectural interventions that articulate a thinking about architectural styles in ways in which I wouldn't be able to do it. And I think that was probably first and foremost Bob Venturi rather than Denise Scott Brown, though they, obviously had a partnership, and she is more of an urban planner by training, certainly made her arguments, and she had many friends from the time at uni. And so I was very, very interested in how she, in the absence of Bob, thought about it. And I spent many, I will say many, many hours in conversations with her. The unfortunate thing is she's a woman in her 90s who sort of understandably wants to defend the work that her husband and their team had done. There is a legacy to defend. I completely understand that and support that. Having said that, in more than a year, she was never able to agree that a need existed.
She wanted to leave the building the way it was, essentially.
Yes. She, of course, hadn't been there in a very long time. I dare say that she likely hadn't been there in 20 plus years. So she wouldn't readily acknowledge that certain things had changed. But in the first place, she said, why does there have to be a main entrance? There are many reasons why there has to be a main entrance, and we can get into this here, but then we'll be here all night and you'll be bored. But so we went round and round and round, and she would tell us that the coat rooms had to be equipped to have wet woolen coats because it rains in England, which I didn't know. So they were many of the same arguments. If I consult my my notebooks, they were pretty much the same four arguments. It's like you needed to provide toilets for people on Trafalgar Square. Well, there are toilets on Trafalgar Square, Denise, but no, those were not the kinds of toilets that people want to go, and the National Gallery should purchase a building for toilets. So you get my point. The argument was not.
She said, though, that did give you pause or strike home or affect anything when you went back to the table?
Everything would give me pause, of course. But to tell me that the ceilings are 9.5 feet tall on the ground floor, because it is as if you are entering a building through a farm bill, a Palladian farm building through the agricultural entrance.
Yeah, no.
Couldn't do it.
Right.
There were many intellectual conversations, and I know it may sound a little bit arrogant, but at some point or another, I said, actually, this is part of Europe. Most people have been to Italy. You and Bob weren't the first people to go to Italy and bring that experience to us and share it with us. There's a kind of arrogance that was part and parcel of the conversation that was unproductive.
Was there ever a point when you kind of, I mean, it sounds like you empathized with her to a great degree.
I still do.
And does it make you think at all about being in that position yourself? You know, with one of your buildings, time has passed, there are new requirements, somebody else comes along and tells you, you know, we got to start from scratch. Well, not start from scratch. We really need to do things differently.
Yeah.
Is your sense of that need for updating your flexibility that you bring to your architecture, do you think that's strong enough for you not to have that same reaction?
I don't think I would ever be as mean, as vengeful, and as noisy as Denise Scott Brown is, but I think her reasons have less to do with what is happening here than with where she's at in life and where she has been. She's obviously been very vociferous about the fact that the Pritzker Prize was awarded to her husband and repeatedly not awarded to her. So there are other reasons that make her at this point in time, at an advanced age, probably, very anxious. But to your point, of course, we care about the architecture that we make, and you protect it and you don't want it changed. But one would hope that one were open to dialogue in both ways. And notably, Denise Scott Brown did a lecture in which she showed a cartoon drawing of a glove and one of a mitten. And her argument was always that buildings would change over time, that you wouldn't know. I'm not making this up, that you couldn't anticipate where buildings were going in the course of their lifetime. And therefore, it would be better to design a mitten rather than a glove that would resist the change.
I have a lot more questions or questions from the audience. We've been talking for a long time, but I have this feeling like it's one of those times where like somebody's getting in a cab and just as they're pulling away, I say, oh, wait, I just wanted one more thing. But at a certain point, the cab pulls away and I'm afraid we've gotten to that time of the evening where that's actually happening. I would love this conversation to go on longer. There's lots of other pictures that you brought that we wanted to see, lots of other.
Can I just show you one?
So that's what I was going to ask you. Show us one
great.
thing that's really important and then we'll
I
decide.
feel like I've spoken negatively about the project. I'm incredibly proud of what we're doing and how, when it's all said and done, it'll be the best Venturi Scott Brown building the world has ever seen. Likely people will, after a while, not remember that it was us revealing all these beautiful truths about the building. And when you look at this image in particular, you see the lawn that pulls forward. And maybe if you look hard behind it, you see a little courtyard. Some part of what we are tasked to do is to provide a better public realm, as in the exterior of the building being a better welcome for visitors. And so what you're seeing here and what has been approved and is under construction now is the lawn pulled back to the first bay and removing the previously unused courtyard and creating something that I like to call the square within a square. In so doing, one thing that happens that I think is really terrific is that you can understand how totally brilliant Venturi Scott Brown's thinking was about the relationship of the new building, the Sainsbury, to the Wilkins building. Now that the buildings are on equal ground, which you couldn't see before because it always looked as if the Wilkins was elevated, and now you can see that the gesture of taking the columns and moving them across what is straight ahead of you, Jubilee Walk, it's just such an interesting, willful gesture that makes so much sense, that is so cognizant of history, but also their own place in that history. And I think revealing that is going to make people understand how these buildings are connected and why that connection is so important.
And I think to end with a rendering by Annabelle Selldorf that looks like a Renaissance painting is kind of perfectly, encapsulates everything we've been talking about.
So we'll keep it at that.
So thank you very much for being patient. Thank you for this. And I invite you all to come back May 23rd when we're talking to Joshua Ramus.